Time is running out if you want to take up the offer of something called early buyout or AAB buyout. So what we have is the letter that's come out to all of us saying that you've got until the 31st of March for this. But very few people understand what is meant by buyout, and particularly the bit where it talks about how many years you can buy out. So this is my explanation of what is meant by buying out years. Everything is based on the lowest state pension age. By that I mean 65. If your state pension age is 68, then there's a gap there of 3 years. And that means you can buy out a maximum of 3 years. You don't have to buy 3 years, you can buy 1, you can buy 2, but you can buy out a maximum of 3 years. If your state pension age is 67, then the gap from 65 is 2 years, and so you can buy out a maximum of 2 years. And if your state pension age is 66, you can buy out only 1 year. If your state pension age is 65, you can't buy out any. Now, each year is calculated as being 3%. So if you're buying out 3 years, that means you can buy out a 9% reduction. If you're buying out 2 years, you can buy out 6%. If you're buying out just the 1 year, then you're buying out a 3% reduction. Now, remember, you don't have to buy out those, you can buy out less. So if you're 68, your state pension age is 68, you can buy out 1, 2 or 3. That I'm going to explain a little bit more in a second. For example, let's take someone with a state pension age of 68. The calculation starts with a table based on someone with a state pension age of 65. Now, the reductions do go month by month. So there's an awful lot more in the table than I'm showing you here. I'm just showing you the whole years, just to make it easier. If I showed you the whole table, it's going to be 12 times as big as this. And I think that's just a bit confusing. So we'll start with just the whole years. Now, that's for a state pension age of 65. But this person we're looking at is a state pension of 68. So we need to make a further reduction of 3 years, each year being that standard 3%. So 3 years, 9% in total. That makes the factor here 91%, 0.91. Multiplying the two factors together, the factor for 65, this extra 9% factor, gives us the factor for somebody whose state pension age is 68 if they go at 55, 56, 57, etc. Now, suppose this teacher in this case, that's for no buyout, suppose the teacher in this case had bought just 1 year. What they're doing is they're getting rid of one of those lots of 3%. So instead of having 3 lots of 3% and being charged 91%, they're only going to have 2 lots of 3%, and therefore they're going to be a reduction of 94%. So they're going to get 94% instead of just getting 91%. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed something different happening at the bottom of the table. If you look at the pension at 66, the reduction factor changes from 94% to 97%, and at 67 to 100%. This is because you have worked those extra years, and so the reduction isn't applied from 65 anymore, the reduction is being applied from the age you've achieved at that time. It's worth noting though, that if you did work to 68, you would get nothing extra for having paid for the buyout. Nothing at all, it's just cancelled, it just disappears into the ether, you've lost that money. Now, that's for a 1 year reduction. What happens if somebody's bought out 2 years? Well, very simply, the 2 year reduction changes, adds another 3%. You've got rid of another one of those 3%. And so for a 2 year reduction, you're now getting 97%. Remember, this person's 68, so the maximum is 3 years. They're only buying out 2. They haven't bought them out all. If they had bought out all of them, then this reduction factor here wouldn't exist at all, and we just go with this column of white numbers. So how does the reduction get calculated? For a start, it depends on how early you take it, and here we hit that first confusing point. The normal pension age is for some is 65, for some it's 66, for some it's 67, and for the youngsters amongst you, 68. Oh, it can also be parts of a year. For this reason, they came up with a single table, and then this is why they've had the reduction factor on it. The table starts with a reduction factor based on someone with a state pension age of 65. Note there's no reduction at age 65. That's indicated by a factor of 1. To use this table for all those who have a later state pension age, it goes on down to 68 and also with no reduction yet. So let's take an example of somebody who's going at 55. We start with the factor based on them being 65. We then add on the factor of them being 2 years later than that, so that's 6%, 94%. And multiplying those two factors together gives us a factor of 0.609. This may seem a complicated process, but the alternative would have been to have separate tables for each and every different state pension age. And so this is probably just about simpler. Now, if you only want to know how the buyout process works, there's no need to watch any further. But I am going to explore the costs and benefits from this later on. So what does buying out a year or 2 or 3 actually mean in pounds and pence? So for an example here, let's suppose that you have a state pension age of 67, and when you get to 55, you've built up a career average pension of £10,000. We start by applying the reduction factor for someone with a state pension age of 65, 0.648. We then add on the 2 years difference between 65 and 67 and apply another factor of 0.94. Then, because we multiply those together, gives us a pension of just over £6,000. So what happens when you buy out the years? In this case, 2 years. Well, what happens, it removes that reduction. We bought out 2 years, we've removed that entire reduction, and that means the amount of pension is going to be calculated is going to be different. The 6% doesn't get used, and the total amount of pension, therefore, is larger. Now, 3% more in your pension sounds like a good deal, and I can see why it is appealing. Indeed, the phrasing around this option is quite seductive, especially when you're tired and fed up and who wouldn't like the idea of getting out early, and the temptation to do it without a penalty is fairly high. But of course, there is a penalty. You have to pay more now. So as ever, let me take the emotion out of the subject and just look at the numbers. Let's start with how much it will cost you now. The cost does depend on how old you are. You are going to pay a percentage of your wage on top of the normal pension reduction. The extra cost is just under 1%. Now, the actual amount is set out in a table and goes from 0.83% to 0.98%. Now, whilst this may look tempting, I mean, spending less than 1% to get 3% more does sound like a good deal, but it's not quite that simple. You're not comparing like for like. The 1% you're paying is 1% of your salary. The 3% you're getting back is 3% of your pension. And most pensions are less than a salary. So let's take this back and go back to pounds and pence. A UPS 3 salary, 46,525. And I'm going to use a mid-range cost of about 0.9%. So different ages, different costs, but we'll go with a mid-range, 0.9%. That means the cost of buying out 1 year would be £418.73. You're going to pay an extra £419-ish. And in return, the pension you build up in this year will get the benefit of not being reduced by quite as much. And the amount you've added to the pension, divide your pension by 57, £816. So you spent £418 and the benefit will be applied to the £816 you added to your pension. So you spent £419, you're going to get £816. The benefit on £816, not £816. Without the buyout, we have that reduction of the age reduction, the 3% reduction, and therefore my £816 at the age of 55 would become worth £513. With the buyout, that 0.97 reduction is cancelled, and therefore the £816 becomes £529 roughly, a difference of just under £16. So I've spent £418, and the benefit I'm getting that in my pension, if you took it at 55, is just under £16. Now, to work out how long that takes to give you your money back, we simply divide how much it cost by how much you're getting, and that gives us 26.5 years. 55 plus 26, 81. So an average life expectancy around about 83, 87, you're going to get just back, just a bit more than you pay in. But there is one more thing to consider. And this is what I call the cumulative advantage. Now, this is not it. Every year, the pension is increased by inflation. Now, that doesn't give you any advantage to the early buyout, but it means you don't lose any value. If you can afford one curry dish for £16 in 2023, it means that you should forever be able to buy that one curry dish because inflation is going to keep it pace with it. That's what's called index linking. It's not what I mean by cumulative advantage. The cumulative advantage is created all the time that you continue teaching, because the pension doesn't increase, not just by inflation, but by an extra 1.6% each year. And over time, this cumulative interest increases and increases the value. So continuing to pay for the early buyout can reduce the number of years that it would take to get your money back. So that £816 value, what you've added to the pension, if you work for 5 years, nearly £870. If you work for 10 years, £940. If you work for 30 years, it's gone up by nearly 50% in terms of its value. That's not inflation. That's just the value due to this 1.6% above inflation. And, of course, it still cost you £419. If you're going to get more back, then the differences get larger and larger over those years. So what we have here then is a difference to start with of £16, but the difference as you go on further gets up to £17, the cost never changing. And that reduces the amount of time it takes to pay your money back. Not a great deal of difference after 5 years, 26 years down to 25 years. But what about the longer term? This shows the progression in value of the amount of pension you get that you added in that first year. The benefit becomes more significant the longer you're in the scheme, and therefore this reduces the amount of time it takes to get your money back. If you do it for 1 year, it's going to take you until 82 to get your money back. But if you go on longer, then you get that first year's value, first year only, because you're paying it all the time, back by the age of 72. But does that mean you'll have all those years in between? And therefore the time it takes to get back all of your money back will be somewhere between these two ages. And because of the impact of compound interest, it's not a linear. You can't simply go halfway in the middle, 77, 76 is going to be the time. That's not how it works. It's going to be closer to the 82 than it is to the 72. But still before an average age. So what about taking it at different ages? That, I go back to the table on 55, 56%, all the way down to 68, 66. And then look at what we would get for those reductions. And you can see that whilst the differences go up, the amount of time it takes to recoup comes down. But when you add those together, the age you take it with the recouping age, you're generally speaking getting your money back if you paid for it for 1 year and then left by the age of 81. Now, there is one other little bit here. If you are, and this is the part that seems to be too good to be true, and I've done another video on this, if you opt for it now, there is this feeling, a rumour, the thing that seems to be too good to be true, that you could get the benefit applied for the last 2 years' money that you've added to the pension already, since April 2022. Letters going out have been saying that you're not going to be charged the arrears. And if that's the case, you could get it for free. We don't know for certain absolutely how that's going to happen, but it's certainly worth looking at the other video. If this one is not convinced you to take out the buyout, have a look at the other one, because that may well be a different case entirely.